Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Beef Reproductive Task Force monthly webinar series. Before we get started tonight, I'm going to pause for another few minutes here, but I encourage people that are joining or as you join, please get your questions into the Q&A box for us to answer. Remember, this is a Q&A session tonight. We do have a number of questions from previous webinars that we're going to try to get to, but as people are joining, I encourage you to go ahead and get those questions into the Q&A box so that we can get those answered. I'm going to pause for a couple minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, well, I will welcome everyone again to the Beef Reproductive Task Force monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Kai Puller from Texas A&M University, one of the task force members, and it's a pleasure to have everyone joining us tonight. I'm welcomed by a great group of other task force members, Dr. Lee Jones from University of Georgia, Dr. Sandy Johnson from K-State University, George Perry from Texas A&M University, Joe Dalton from University of Idaho, and Jared Decker from University of Missouri, and also Vitor Mercadante from Virginia Tech University. And the goal for tonight is, one of the things, and first of all, we really appreciate everyone's attendance and the number of webinars and virtual events that we've had this year. It's been a real joy to have everyone join us, and the number of questions have been really too many to handle as we try to end each of the webinar series. And so one of the things that we wanted to do as people are moving into the spring breeding season is we wanted to answer as many questions tonight as we could as people had about the webinar series or questions that came up along that way. We also have questions that come in to ask the experts at beefrepro.org that sometimes we can't get to that we want to ask or answer. And so that's really the goal of tonight. So again, I encourage everyone, please get your questions in to the Q&A session. I'm going to act as the moderator tonight and try to get these questions out to the right folks on the task force here to answer them, and we'll move through as many as we can. We have an hour planned, and we'll stay here as long as we need to get as many answered as we can. So with that, Vitor has this recording, and we're also streaming on Facebook Live. So we'll go ahead and get started. So with the first question, I'm curious as to the causes of persistent follicles and by what means of reproductive productivity that might have and how they can be resolved. I think I will call on George Perry. Dr. Perry, if you mind addressing this question.
Yeah, thanks, Kai. So we've done a lot of work with persistent follicles. So low levels of progesterone, whether it's from a Cedar or MGA or not really common in beef cattle, but sometimes in dairies, when progesterone gets low, what happens is we change the pulse frequency of luteinizing hormone. And so that's what really drives follicular growth. And so when we change those pulses, what we do is we create an environment that causes a follicle to live longer than it's supposed to. So it's not a good thing for fertility. In a persistent follicle, when it's grown longer than of normal duration, then what we get when it ovulates is actually the oocyte or the egg in the follicle becomes aged, and the fertility of that egg is decreased. And so even though it might fertilize, the incidence of early embryonic loss increases. And so what causes it are really low levels of progesterone, and it's not good for fertility. We want to try avoid breeding off of those. That's why the longer protocols, we don't breed on the estrus right after we remove that progesterone. So, Guy?
Yeah. Hey, George, would you mind just following up on that and mentioning, what you mean by long-term protocols and what some of those examples might be, and why, just really focus in on why we don't breed off those long-term protocols on that first estrus.
And so the original long-term protocols were the MGA protocols, where we fed MGA for 14 days, but also even the 14-day Cedar protocols. And there's even data out that when you get out to 9 days with a Cedar, you can have decreased fertility. And so we want to make sure that if it's more than the 7-day protocols, we want to make sure we don't breed on that first estrus afterwards.
And what can we do, George, to treat those cows that have cystic follicles? What are some causes, treatments, and are there long-term productivity consequences of cows that have persistent follicles? And then I'm going to add a question that's not on there and ask you, is there a difference between a persistent follicle and, let's say, a persistent CL where you have this luteal tissue that's on the ovary?
And so that's actually a really good question. There is a difference. And so when people talk about cyst or even persistence, the first thing we have to do is clarify whether we're talking about follicular cyst or luteal cyst. A persistent follicle, as I said earlier, occurs when progesterone is low. We change LH pulse frequency, and it just hangs around longer than we expect it to, or it should naturally hang around. When we get into cysts and that, they can hang around much longer. Can we treat them? Yes. If it's a follicular cyst, that's where you're using GnRH or gonadotropin releasing hormone, versus if it's a luteal cyst, we need to get prostaglandin to actually try to regress that luteal tissue. Now, sometimes if you are palpating or that and there is a follicular cyst, they can rupture, which is fine. A lot of times after they rupture, they'll luteinize, and then we can follow that up with prostaglandin to regress that luteal tissue. Now, if there's long-term consequences, there are some animals, if it occurs naturally, not from a Cedar or MGA, animals will continue to have them. Even if they get over one, sometime down the road, they'll come back and have it again. It's very common in the dairy breeds, not quite as common among beef animals, but it is something that if you see it frequently or that you want to watch that animal so that you can see if it's just something that happens once or if it reoccurs over and over again, where it's more of a cystic situation.
All right, I appreciate that, Dr. Perry. The next question, and I see Vitor, thanks for addressing that question. People are asking if these are recorded, if the other sessions are archived. Yes, I'd encourage you to visit our YouTube channel and the Beef Reproductive Task Force. You can find everything there. The next question I'll direct to Dr. Lee Jones, and I also know Dr. George Perry has done a lot on this, so maybe you can both chime in here. I would like to be certain I understand the recommended vaccination protocols for females. Modified live only at weaning with killed forever after that question mark. I think that as we move into this time of year and we're getting ready for spring breeding seasons, there's a lot of questions that go into vaccination protocols. And a lot of times, maybe sometimes we get behind the 8 ball on when we give our vaccines. Dr. Jones, could you address that maybe from a veterinary perspective and kind of how you work with your clients and what your recommendations are on and how you feel that should go?
Sure, Kai. Yes, absolutely. Like you said, sometimes we get clients just realize suddenly, oh my goodness, it's time to either synchronize or turn bulls out, and they realize that they haven't vaccinated their cows yet, and so they ask me. Historically, we always said go ahead and vaccinate anyway because the vaccination is very important. But Dr. Perry and the group up there in the Dakota saw some significant effects on fertility this is not a simple thing. How vaccines impact fertility, is it direct effects on the ovary? Is it indirect effects? The vaccination, the immune response takes a lot of calories, takes a lot of energy, and it also depletes mineral and vitamins. So if we have any marginal levels of those when we vaccinate, then we might see depletions, and those animals might not recover those levels sufficiently. We may impact other systems like the reproductive system. So those things can be complicated, I guess, by a nutrition program, or even perhaps mitigated by a nutrition program. So whether that's the case or it's a direct effect, we certainly want to use that modified live according to the label, and at least no sooner than 30 days. Now the question is, should I end up going with a killed? If your heifers are very, very well vaccinated, and my clients, we typically like to see 3, maybe even 4 doses by the time that they're put into the group of heifers that we're going to breed, and then a killed thereafter. That's a really good program, because if we've already stimulated our cell-mediated immunity, and some people claim we can accomplish that in 1 dose, 3 to 4 doses definitely is going to get that. But if we've already stimulated cellular mediated immunity, and then we come back with a killed product, then we're also stimulating the humoral immunity, and now our immune system is hitting on all 8 cylinders. So a killed program after a modified live, say after they've had their first calf or after they go into the cow herd, is certainly a very, very good program. And obviously there's no data that I'm aware of where killed vaccines have any impact whatsoever, negative impact on fertility. It was interesting today, I did some old literature reviews on the use of modified lives at the beginning of synchronization, found some use of modified lives with the old Synchromate B back in the 90s. And there were a couple of papers that actually reported an increase in the pregnancy rate following synchronization with the use of modified live. So that may have been in the days before we were testing for BVD. So there could have been a pathogen in pressure on those herds. So, we vaccinate for protection. If there's pathogen protection or pathogen pressure, then those vaccines are probably doing their job and stimulating the immune system to protect the herd. So it's not a simple question. Definitely want to work this out with your veterinarian. And but the ideal would be to go ahead and vaccinate if you're going to use a modified live at least 30 days before we turn bulls out or before we're going to AI. And I'll certainly, George, I know y'all have done a lot of research on this, and if you've got anything to add, please do.
Yeah, I'll ask George to add in here, and I think I just want to emphasize one point that Dr. Jones said before Dr. Perry speaks here, is it's really important for everyone to work with your veterinarian. I think the veterinary client relationship in these type of situations is really important, and obviously as a task force, we really encourage that across the board. So Dr. Perry, if you would go ahead and give us your thoughts on that same question.
I was going to say, Lee hit on one of the biggest things there. A lot really depends upon your risk factors. Yes, we have data that shows using a modified live within 30 days pre-breeding decreased fertility. But just like he pointed out, in certain situations, you might still be better off with that than not doing anything. And so that's where working with your local vet to know what risk factors there are in your area is important. If you're in a risky environment or have neighbors that are doing risky things that may expose your herd, you need to take that into consideration. But we've worked with lots of herds, and as Dr. Jones said, if you get modified lives into them around weaning, get those 2 to 3 doses in before they're bred the first time, and go back to killed vaccines, it's a very good protocol and works very well. But you need to visit with your local vet on what your exposures to, what is in the area and what your risk factors are. If you're getting cattle from the sale barn every week, you're in a much more risky situation than a lot of areas where it's just your cow herd. And so all of those things need to come into play. But from all the work we've done, one of the things I will emphasize is getting it into them well before breeding. We don't want to vaccinate animals right around breeding because, as we said, there's many other things involved, nutrition in that. And if you're pulling from that, you can pull from the reproduction. And so we don't want to risk anything that can impact reproduction there.
All right, appreciate both you chiming in there. So please, as you're joining us tonight, go ahead and get your questions into the Q&A. I just want to make a quick plug here. So we have 6 reproductive physiologists, biologists, or veterinarians on this call tonight, and we also have 1 beef genetics genomics specialist, Dr. Decker from University of Missouri. So please also, if there's genetics questions, Dr. Decker is part of the task force that we can help address tonight. We'd be happy to take those questions as well. So with that, I'll move on to the next question, and I think I'll direct this one to Dr. Johnson from K-State. Why are some first calf heifers so difficult to get rebred? What do we do to synchronize them for AI? Is there a pre-treatment that we can use prior to the AI protocol? What are your thoughts on that, and sort of challenges and strategies to make that happen?
Sure. You know, that first calf heifer is still growing, so that's part of the challenge we have. And I don't know in your situation if you're able to keep that first calf heifer, the cow with the first calf separate from other older cows. But often when they're all grouped together, then that, you know, they can't compete as well. So they've calved for the first time. They're trying to often compete with cows that are bigger than them for the same diet. And then in many of our operations, we've selected for perhaps more milk than what our environment might be able to supply. And so any combination of those can make it very difficult. And one of the important things I think a person can do to help get more of those young cows rebred is to use a limited length breeding season, which automatically gives them so use a limited length breeding season. Their first breeding season is yearling heifers. So then they have more time to recover from calving and regain a positive energy balance before it's time for them to rebreed. And then often breeding those young cows ahead of the mature herd is another thing that we can do in order to give them every opportunity. I think a long heifer breeding season just puts those late bred females at a risk of being open and never having a early born calf. So there are several management things we can do. Then when we look at synchronization, there was a study that compared a longer term 14-day Cedar to the 7-day protocol. Don't believe they saw a lot of difference in that study. I don't remember what proportion of those cows, young cows, were cycling or not. But both of those systems are using progestin to try and induce cows to cycle. And so I really think management, really before we ever come to that second breeding season, are the most important steps. Making sure those females match their environment. And then I think that can help a lot. And then, you know, making sure they're big enough when they calve so that they should have a little extra condition when they calve to go through that stress and not have such a big hill to climb to start cycling again.
Yep. Thanks, Andy. And if any of the other panelists want to jump in, you know, feel free at any moment to jump in. I'm going to ask this next question. I'm going to direct it to Dr. Jones in that same line of thought. And anybody that has any data in this area, I know we've done a few projects in this area, and we often hear, you know, beef cows don't have postpartum uterine infections. And I think that to some degree, obviously, it's a lot lower than what we see on the dairy side. But maybe could you speak a little bit about subclinical uterine infections, maybe in first calf heifers or first calf cows, and kind of what your thoughts on that are from a veterinary point of view?
Well, anything that's going to lead to difficulty calving, delayed calving, is also going to increase uterine inflammation and decrease clearance and lead to a delayed uterine involution, guys. So yes, those types of things. Obviously, it's going to go back to our nutrition program, making sure those cattle are in good body condition. All of our vitamin mineral levels are adequate. But typically, if the cow doesn't have any difficulty calving, no retained placentas or no delay in or no dystocia and delay in delivering that calf, and then that calf gets up and nurse adequately and gets oxytocin flowing, then usually you're going to have a kind of a normal, typical uterine involution and then just return to normalcy. And then, of course, that's going to help as far as the animal rebreeding, because we know that uterine inflammation is going to delay returning to estrus. So really, the main risk factors are if you do have heifers that are going to have difficulty calving, if they are maybe a little bit marginal on nutrition, stay with them. Make sure you get that calf delivered. If you're going to deliver a calf, make sure we do it with lots of lubrication and as hygienically as possible, because we don't want to be the source of introducing pathogens or introducing debris into that uterus, and just help them get those calves delivered as quickly as possible. So that's the biggest consideration there, is both nutrition and getting those calves delivered quickly.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Jones, for that. And I'll just say, I think in the studies that we've done and some of my colleagues have done, I think we see about 10-15% of subclinical uterine issues in the beef herd. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate that. I think that's important to keep an eye on. And maybe that's that 10% of cows that have some calving issue or retained placenta that correlate directly with that. So really important things to consider as we think about what the maximum level of our cow herd fertility is as we move forward. The next question I'm going to direct to Dr. Joe Dalton. Dr. Dalton is unique in his expertise in that he has both dairy and beef expertise. So we call on him often when we get these type of questions. What are your general thoughts on double breeding? I have heard mixed opinions on this practice. In the case of the dairy cow, that are still observing standing heat the next day after breeding, off of standing heat, do you breed, do you not breed, those type of things. Joe, would you mind chiming in on that a little bit?
Sure, thanks, Kai. Yeah, the question is a good one, and there are 3 or 4 things we kind of have to juggle when we're thinking about this. One of the things we have to juggle with is what behavioral characteristics are we using to identify an animal in estrus? How often and for how long will we be observing for estrus, or how will we identify that animal in estrus? And then the other opportunity, or the other factor kind of plays into it, is ability to breed that animal on successive days. Now, in a dairy situation, where we're dealing primarily with many animals per pen in a lockup situation, we're looking at once a day estrus observation, usually based on tail paint or tail chalk. It's fairly simple to breed an animal based off tail paint and tail chalk one day, and then come back the next day and say, you know what, she might have been starting yesterday, but she still rubbed off, so I'll go ahead and rebreed her. In that case, you're trying to err on the side of caution, in that you are a little bit early. If we look at the physiology of sperm, though, in general, sperm are known to live approximately 24 hours in the reproductive tract. That's an average. Okay, there will of course be bulls that have sperm longevity. It's a little bit shorter, there will be bulls that have sperm longevity a little bit longer. So you have to kind of weigh that decision of what's the cost of the dose, what's the ability of us to catch the cow up. And in dairy, it's fairly easy to do. In beef, it could be much more difficult to do because now we're talking about not a lockup situation. We're talking about totally different handling situation. We're talking about the ability to gather animals back up, run them through the chute, etc. So where do I generally go with this? I generally go with what were the original indications that a decision was made on whether to breed this animal or not. In the case of should I breed or shouldn't I breed, ultimately, we should always put semen in rather than making the egg weight. So I would always err on the side of caution. And if she looks like she has 2 or 3 signs, for example, an activated patch or tail paint rubbed off or a swollen vulva or mucus, long stringy mucus, then I would go ahead and inseminate that animal. That way you have sperm inside the reproductive tract. You have enough time for capacitation and sperm transport before ovulation. If you come back the next day and you're able to, and this animal is more rubbed off, the patch is fully activated, she's missing hair on the pin bones, then I'd go ahead and inseminate her again. That's the way I would address that.
Whoops, I was on mute. Thanks a lot, Joe. Dr. Decker, are you with us? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so you never want a reproductive physiologist to answer any genetics or genomics questions, so I'm going to call on you on 2 here. The first one is, we're putting a lot of faith in the Breed Economic Index EPDs for our replacement heifers and bull selection. We're using ASA's API, Red Indexes, ProS, and Angus $C. How sure can we be that those indexes are helping us pick cattle that fit our environment fairly well? It's in an arid, dry environment with about 15% or 15 inches of annual precipitation.
Yeah. So when we're considering indexes, the question I always like to pose is, what's the most important trait in cattle production? And usually with an audience, there will be a whole slew of answers, but the reason all of those different answers are important is because they affect profitability. So the most important trait in cattle production is profit, and the EPD for profit is an economic selection index. Now, the indexes that producer mentioned were all-purpose indexes, right? So those indexes are going to take from conception to slaughter into account. And they're also making the assumption that we're keeping replacement females. So those indexes are going to put emphasis on those reproductive traits that would be important for keeping replacement females. That's in comparison to a terminal index where we're assuming we're not keeping any heifers out of that mating. So the indexes work really well. There's been field trials that have been done, and they accurately predict profit differences between cattle. Now, the kind of second part to that question was some concern about cattle matching their environment, specifically a more arid environment. Sandy's already mentioned one of the factors that you might want to consider in a more arid environment, and that would be identifying cattle, identifying genetics that probably have in the bottom of the breed for milk potential. So just trying to moderate that milk potential so that we make sure we're not identifying cows that are going to produce more milk than the environment can really stand. Another thing that you might want to put added emphasis on is mature cow weight, if it's available for the different breed. Moderating that should help in an arid environment where feed resources are limited. And the other thing is if like a stayability or a sustained cow fertility EPD is available, identifying those cows that have higher genetic potential for sustained success, sustained fertility should also help in those more arid environments. So I think it's the right thing to focus on the indexes. If you're running into problems, you might want to put some additional criteria on some of those other maternal traits that may affect their efficiency of production.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to ask you one more question while I have you on here. Can we get accurate numbers using genomics on commercial cattle similar to EPD accuracy on purebreds?
So if you use a DNA test designed for commercial heifers, those tests typically do not report an accuracy value, okay? So if you buy a GeneMax Advantage test, they're not going to report an accuracy. If you buy an iGenity Beef or a Red Navigator, etc., you're not going to get accuracy values with those. Basically, the reason for that is all of those animals are going to have basically the same level of accuracy. And that level of accuracy is going to be equal to if they had about 10 to 20 progeny, and those progeny had data on all of the traits that have EPDs predicted for that test. So if we're talking about testing commercial heifers, I don't think there's any reason to be concerned with accuracy. The other point that I would make there is my group has done some field demonstrations of these, specifically GeneMax Advantage, and for all of the traits that we considered, they significantly predicted calf performance. So the tests that we now have available as an industry in terms of genomic panels work really well. They provide us with accurate descriptions of the genetic merit of those commercial cattle. One last point I need to make in terms of testing commercial females is you have to use the information to actually get a return on that investment. So if you need to keep 20 replacement females and you only DNA test 20 heifers, you're not using that information to make a decision. So if we need to keep 20 replacement females, we probably need to DNA test 40 heifers and use the genomic results to select the top half of those to keep as replacements. The other ways that you can see a return on investment for purchasing that genomic test is by using that information to market their steer mates, and there's several programs available to do that. And then also, you now have a picture of that cow's genetic merit for the rest of her lifetime, and you can match her up with a bull that matches her strengths and her weaknesses.
All right, thanks a lot, Jared. Really appreciate that. Again, as people join tonight and as you're joining us, please send in your questions on the Q&A so that we can get those answered as we move through tonight's session. Move out on to the next question. I'm just going to throw this one out for the entire panel, and this will be kind of like Jeopardy. Whoever jumps in first will get to answer it. Does timing of AI influence the sex of the calf? If nobody jumps in, then I'm going to call on someone.
I'm going to jump in, Kai.
All right, go for it, Joe.
Okay, so this is a common question, and it's kind of cloudy because there are some reports that use very small numbers of animals, not only from, let's say, master's theses in the US, but from international research sources. In general, the data is not compelling that either in a natural or a timed AI situation, extending insemination, having it done earlier or later, closer to ovulation or further away, that you will tend to get more heifers or more bull calves. So it's kind of cloudy. My crystal ball is really cloudy. I tell people, you know, if we're worried about number of bull calves or number of heifers, you know, we've got sex semen that's available. And that's where we really need to go, because we know how that works. We have thousands of inseminations on the sex semen products that are available, and we know exactly how that's going to work. So that's the way I would go. Timing of insemination, to summarize it, in my review of the literature, very, very small data sets and not compelling data.
And as I wait for other people to chime in there, and thanks a lot, Joe, for that response. You know, one thing that I will point out is that the Beef Reproductive Task Force this year released a protocol sheet specific for sex semen. And so if you have a desire to generate either male or female calves only, please go to beefrepro.org and you can find those protocol sheets there. Anything else anybody wants to add on that and their thoughts? Dr. Perry, I saw you unmuted yourself. I'll let you take it away.
So no, I think Joe was right on there. I mean, I think the other place some of that comes from is in some other species. There might be some data that shows nutrition or that can, but in beef cattle or dairy cattle, I'd agree. There's very little data that supports that. And most of our timed AI protocols would tell you, if you look at it, you know, the ones that do and don't show estrus, we've got lots of data on different timing, and we see no skews in the sex distribution. So in cattle, like you said, or like you said, we have sex semen now. If you want to skew it, do it that way.
And while we're on the topic of sex semen, we've had a question come in as, is there any chance to get more sex semen available in the future? I guess this is referring to more option on bulls, the ability to be able to sex bulls, maybe the success of sex semen in the field of beef reproductive management. I know, George, you and Joe have both done a lot of work in that area. If y'all mind just commenting on that in general.
Well, I think there's lots of people looking for other ways. The best method, or the only proven method to date, is on DNA content, which both the Sexcel and ST's patents are on the amount of DNA in the sperm. There's always discussion on, are there differences in surface proteins and that. I have not seen a lot of data that says that's getting anywhere close to commercializing. So will somewhere down the future be? Maybe. As far as figuring out why some bulls are allowed to be sexed the way we are, there's lots of work being done on that area. So hopefully we can start to figure some of that out and figure out how to improve what we can do. But I don't see a lot of new methods or that coming available. I think it's going to be more improving what we have out there. Joe, any other comments?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's going to be improving on what we have. Some of the limitations for the provision or for the providing of sex semen by current providers is just the equipment speed and the ability to process enough sperm cells in a 24-hour period. While the machines look at thousands of sperm cells a second, we're generally talking about 2 to 4 million minimum in a sex semen dose. So there are some limitations there. There have been advances made in the current processing, whether it's for ST or whether it's the Sexcel product. But I think that's the mechanical organizational kind of processing is kind of a limitation now. Relative to identification of bulls and why some bulls sort well, why their semen sorts well and others, that's continues to be under investigation, but no eureka moments yet. No one's really figured that out yet.
Thanks a lot for those comments from both of you. I'm going to switch back a little bit to the genetic side, and Jared asked you to address this, and I'm going to ask it from a genetics point of view, and then anybody from the reproductive physiology side that wants to chime in, please do so. Jared, any concern with, as we think about the elite sires are the ones that make it into bull studs, right? And into the major AI facilities as we think about them. And so any concern in regards to being able to maintain sort of hybrid vigor in the cow herd as we look at sort of I don't know if bottlenecking of the genetics is the right term. And I guess I'm going to add to the question here a little bit. If you see what has happened maybe on the Holstein side, where we have sort of a large inbreeding coefficient or a moderate inbreeding coefficient, your thoughts on that from a genetics point of view, and what your advice or thoughts are in regards to a commercial cow-calf guy and a purebred breeder?
Yeah, so luckily, when we compare beef and dairy, especially for commercial production, inbreeding really becomes less of a concern because we can create crossbred cows that really alleviate any inbreeding depression that we can have within a single herd. So if we got into a situation where we had severe inbreeding in Angus or Hereford, for the commercial guys, they may see very little impact because they would be crossing those animals with another breed. And as soon as we cross out to that other breed, basically the inbreeding depression is going to go away. So that's kind of a theory, is that hybrid vigor is simply the release of inbreeding depression. So if we think about that ability to do crossbreeding, inbreeding depression becomes a lot less of a concern. Now, if we want to talk about within a single breed, I think for most of the breeds that are numerically large in the US, inbreeding depression is probably really not a concern. It would only be a concern if we were doing lots of close matings. So for most of the numerically large breeds, it's not a concern for me. If we're talking about some of the more numerically smaller breeds, I don't know that there's an easy solution there, but for the top 12 or so breeds in the US, probably not a big concern.
All right, thanks a lot, Jared. I'm gonna throw a general question out here. Have a question that came in to say, there's a question about giving injectable prostaglandin, injection of prostaglandin after the time of AI breeding. I'm guessing around the time or shortly after AI breeding. I guess this is referring to maybe some of the data that shows positive effects of using prostaglandin to help in the ovulation process. I don't think this is something that we currently recommend, but would anybody like to take this question on?
I can speak to that a little bit, Kai. John Yeager, who is a colleague of mine at Hayes, had some data kind of looking at that when he was in Oregon, and we followed up with some other studies in some heifers. Didn't have a tremendous number in that data set, but did not find any advantage in either with or without prostaglandin at AI, and probably 150 heifers per treatment.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Appreciate that. Yeah. So I would say that, the data at this point doesn't, we're not in a situation to recommend that based on what we know. If anybody else have anything to add there? Okay, if not, I'm gonna flip it back to Jared Decker to address and talk a little bit about some of the work that they're doing on identifying heifers ready for a Cedar and a Time AI protocol or Time AI system. And Jared, you want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you guys are doing in selection of those heifers and sort of how the genomics and genetic side plays into that?
Yeah, so Brian asked the question, what strategies can best be implemented to help identify heifers ready for the Cedar in a timed AI system? What sync protocols for heifers has best results? I can't answer part B, but I'll answer part A. So for over 20 years in Missouri, we've had what's called the Show Me Select program. And that program implements a number of best practices to help producers in terms of kind of precision heifer development. And so one of the important steps in that program is 30 days prior to the start of the breeding season, we do a pre-breeding exam. At that pre-breeding exam, we collect two important data points. The first is a reproductive tract score. That is a 1 to 5 score based on physically palpating the reproductive tract. But those 1 to 5 scores also line up to things happening in terms of the hormone profile of that heifer. And so that reproductive tract score identifies heifers that have either reached puberty and are ready to start the breeding season, that would be good candidates to go into a timed AI protocol, or they identify heifers that are very close to reaching puberty and could be perhaps induced into reaching puberty through one of the long-term synchronization protocols. And then importantly, it also identifies those heifers that are reproductive tract scores 1 and 2s, and they are much further away from reaching puberty. And so what my colleague Dave Patterson has said is if we don't have the majority of those heifers having a reproductive tract score of 3 or higher, then that group of heifers will need more time to be prepared for the start of the breeding season. Now, one of the things that my group has done, because we had this great Show Me Select resource, is we went to the USDA for funding, and we're actually going to be looking at the genetics and genomics of reproductive tract scores, pelvic measurements. Pelvic measurements is going to be used basically as an indicator trait for puberty. When those heifers reach puberty, that pelvic area starts to grow more rapidly. And then we're also going to have ultrasound data to measure when in the breeding season that heifer gets bred. And so like Sandy was talking about, we want to identify those heifers that get bred early in the breeding season, because then that sets them up to be successful the next year. And they also wean a older and heavier calf. So we're going to be looking at the genetics and genomics of these puberty and fertility traits, and we'll hopefully generate research that will then get adopted by breed associations. So instead of a simple yes/no heifer pregnancy phenotype, we'll add some additional traits into that and kind of take a multi-pronged approach to trying to improve heifer fertility from a genetic standpoint.
Thanks, Jared. Anybody would like to address that second part of the question in regards to protocols available for heifers? I'll just start off by saying, I hate to redirect you to the website, but the beefrepro.org website, we have a synchronization protocol sheet specifically developed for heifers. That those protocols have a lot of data to back them up. I encourage you to visit that. Any panelists want to just address any of those briefly for heifer protocols?
Well, I can make a comment on that, Kai, and I think what works best is going to vary with the situation and what you can deliver effectively, as well as what have you used a reproductive tract score like Jared mentioned? You've sorted off all the small those with the low tract scores, all those things would go into that decision. If the heifers are ready to breed and good flesh, I think that the comparative data we have is that those systems work pretty similarly, and you know, do what you can implement most effectively, and trying to find the best protocol of the day. You know, I just don't think there's that much difference in, you know, several studies have tried to compare those and not seen any significant difference. And I'll let my colleagues add to it if they want.
Yeah, I agree with, I'm sorry. I agree
No,
with
go ahead.
Sandy. Yeah, I agree with Sandy. I think that, you know, if heifers are ready, about any one of the protocols is going to work, and you don't need to spend a lot of time, prep time, trying to get them ready, so you can use one of the shorter protocols and go ahead and get those heifers bred. But it's just like Jared also said, if those heifers are at, you know, possibly in transition or even not quite there yet, then they're going to need more time. And in the data that we've looked at the UGA heifer evaluation and development, our herd program, they it's shown that the longer protocols actually will even out a group of heifers that may have reproductive tract scores all over the board. So if I've got heifers coming in from a lot of different management programs into one location, I might be better off with a long-term protocol. The benefit of long-term protocols, the long-term progesterone, as well as the nutrition. So I've got a period of time there of 30 to 45 days where I can actually ramp up nutrition. And we know that shows tremendous benefit, both to get heifers cycling as well as get them up to a little bit better weight.
So along those same lines, I mean, we get a lot of questions, I think, all the time as, you know, which protocol is better for cows, which protocol is better for heifers, and commonly we hear, well, what about protocols for embryo transfer, and how do those work? We don't have a recommended protocol sheet for embryo transfer. This is a question open to anyone. I'll just you know, share a little bit of what my philosophy is here. You know, in embryo transfer, you know, the main focus is we're trying to get a cow to turn over a follicle, to have a corpus luteum at the time of transfer. And obviously there's data to show that there's differences in corpora lutea depending on blood flow, those type of things, size, etc. And I think a lot of the same rules of thumb and science that we use for estrus synchronization for AI are also true for embryo transfer. And so in my case, I normally recommend people to seek the sheets. If you're talking about cows, to use a protocol that works well in cows, have your recips and good body condition score. If you go to beefrepro.org, you know, in the past proceedings, we've had a number of talks about recipient management, that type of thing. That's just my personal opinion. I'll let other panelists jump in here and say anything that they might have.
I agree there, Kai, because, you know, we're not trying to time an oocyte and conception, but we're looking for a really good corpus luteum so that we know that we're going to go ahead and use that recip and get an embryo put in. One of the things that has shown up lately in some data that I'm working on, hadn't been published yet, but we've been looking at some groups of recips where we might go ahead and use GnRH. It's kind of like a cleanup fixed time AI protocol where you would put patches on recips, and the ones that don't have a rubbed patch would go ahead and get a shot of GnRH at, say, 60 hours or 72 hours after Cedar pull and prostaglandin. The herds that had the least amount of GnRH used in those recips had the highest pregnancy rates to embryo transfer. So anything that we can get where we're getting good estrus expression, where those cows are showing a good heat, which obviously is also tied to estradiol secretion, anytime that we can get that good estrus expression, it seems like we're going to have better results with our embryo transfer. We come in and transfer 120 or 150 embryos all at one time. We're not looking at, you know, when they came in heat, but we're going ahead. So having some way to see what our heat response is in those recips can be a little bit predictive of our results.
Thanks for that insight. The next question we're going to move to here is I'm going to point this to Dr. Dalton and Dr. Perry, and then anybody else that wants to chime in. You know, there's the big question as to why some bulls work well in time AI and why some don't. And this is a question that we've debated and talked about for a long time. I think we all have our own opinions as to why this is the case. Any work that y'all can speak of or aware of in regards to things being done in order to identify those bulls? And I guess this goes into the bigger question of bull fertility from the AI point of view. And if y'all have some insight, I know obviously, George, you're doing some stuff in that area. Joe, you're doing some stuff in that area. If y'all can just speak a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, there's lots of work being done in that area. I can say we've personally used bulls that have great fertility, whether we breed prior to estrus or after estrus, and other bulls that have horrible fertility if you breed prior to estrus. And so we know there's tremendous differences in the bull fertility. We are looking at different things that we can measure, and that comes up. There's actually several questions in here on what is there better ways for timed AI and stuff, and there's lots of work being done. Right now, there's nothing that is any silver bullet, and I don't think there's ever going to be. You know, a study we did a few years ago, you don't realize there's several hundred proteins on the sperm head. All of those things play a role, everything from sperm transport to sperm binding in the oviduct to sperm binding the actual egg for fertilization. And so all of those different things, as well as some work we're doing with microRNAs, can affect embryo development. And so when we look at that, and it comes into a study we're working on right now that's separating a little bit out of what we get back as field fertility data and some of the things we can measure. And when we get back field fertility data, the great thing is the bulls that are great, everything worked right. The bulls that are lower, now you have to question, why are they lower? Are they lower because of poor sperm transport, of poor embryo development? Was it the cows? All of those different things come into play. And so it makes it very difficult to separate some of those things out. But there's lots of work being done. I think one of the big breakthroughs in the future we're probably looking at is going to be on the male side. I think we know a lot on the female, but I think there's still a lot of work for us to do on the male side. So, Joe, I'll let you add to that.
Thanks, George. Yeah, you know, there continues to be a lot of work done on this, and we have the capability to analyze numerous characteristics of sperm, and we do it routinely in the lab. It's not just motility, morphology, acrosome intact or not intact anymore. We can run samples through computer-assisted sperm analyzers and get just gobs of data. But the question that we're struggling with is trying to put that together with field fertility data, and we're really struggling. And what it comes down to sometimes is, yes, we're asking many questions. We're asking, what's the effect of this? What's the effect of that? But many times we haven't asked the right question yet because we haven't discovered it yet. So that ongoing research is occurring, is great. There will not be, I don't believe, a silver bullet like George mentioned, because there are so many different factors that play a role in the ability of a male to fertilize the egg. And also then we're talking about AI doses. We're talking about how they were processed, how they were transported and distributed, how semen handling occurred, the AI technician, all of these types of things. And then we're talking about timing in a certain protocol. And timing in the timed AI protocols we have now is very good. But is it universal for all bulls? Probably not. Then we have to look at, what about mucus flow? Things like this, the ability for sperm transport to occur, all these types of things. So to summarize, yes, work is being done on it. We have thrown the book at it literally, and every computer we can figure out at it. haven't quite figured out what makes one bull really good and what makes another bull not so good within a timed AI situation.
All right, thanks a lot for those answers. So as we wrap up tonight, you know, we're already at our time limit, but I'm going to take an extra 5 minutes here. And as I started in the beginning tonight, you know, we're moving into the spring breeding season. Obviously, it's a decision-making time for a lot of us as to breed choices, protocols, use, how we're going to run it, those type of things. And so what I want to do to end tonight is I'm going to go around the panelists here, and I'm going to ask for everyone to just share one piece of advice that you could give to folks as we leave here tonight in this parting way, and you know, to think about, to go into the breeding season, and things to consider. So with that, not to pick on our genomics geneticists first, but I'm going to ask Jarrett to lead us off, because I think that decision probably needs to be made before what protocol you're going to use. So Jarrett, if you want to go first and lead us into that.
Yeah, so the most simple way to identify bulls is going to be to rank bulls based on an economic selection index. Instead of being overwhelmed by all the numbers on the page, you can focus on one number, and that number is designed in a way that will improve your profitability. So that's going to simplify your decision making. It's going to make that decision making quicker, consistent, and help your bottom line.
Thanks, Jarrett. Sandy, I'll ask you to go next.
All right, I done mute. You know, I think for me, the thing I see is that people need to remember a successful breeding season. We need to start planning that really, to me, when we wean that calf off, and really deciding when we wean that calf and managing that cow condition. And if we can get that cow or heifer where she needs to be, she'll reproduce for us. And so don't focus on right in the middle or right before the breeding season. It starts long before that to put everything in order for successful reproduction.
Thanks, Sandy. Lee, I'll ask you to go next, and I'm going to ask maybe for a perspective from a veterinary client relationship, and kind of, you know, how you, you know, I think that's an important relationship to have. Obviously, you can speak to that better than I can, but also, you know, how to go into it with that mentality and sort of sorting that out throughout the breeding season.
Well, Sandy hit the nail on the head. You know, really and truly, our breeding season success this year started at weaning last year. And did we, you know, when we were preg checking cows, did we check those cows' body condition and then make those recommendations to try to manage those cattle so they calved in a body condition score of at least 5 and maybe 6, depending on our environment? But that's going to have a lot to do with whether or not we successfully get through calving with the least amount of problems, and then we get those cows rebred. So yeah, I mean, you know, when we look at an estrus synchronization program, you know, using the information that's been given here and what Jared has talked about, making sure those heifers are ready to go, making sure the heifers are, you know, are mature enough, have reached puberty, hit our target weights that we're looking at, and then the cows are in good body condition, vaccinated well ahead. I know this is, gosh, sorry, Kai, I probably listed about 5 things here instead of 1. But, you know, it's that big picture, so many things to make sure that we've got, and if you've got a good veterinarian, I used to actually call my clients, you know, things were happening. We had a calendar, we were working, and I'd start calling them, and, you know, and they'd come in, and, you know, we would go ahead and start talking about setting up our calendars and setting up our schedules to make sure that we got those important things done.
Thanks, Lee. Joe, I'll ask you to go next.
Okay, thanks, Kai. Semen handling. For those of you that practice AI, semen handling is traditionally a very weak link. Okay, a lot of mistakes are made with semen handling. You got to remember time, temperature, hygiene, and skill. And the other thing I'm going to say about semen handling is it's really important from the standpoint of we've put all this money and all this effort into synchronizing these animals, and we need to pay attention just to the basics, just to the basics. So that's where I would focus from an AI standpoint is semen handling. And I can put a plug in here on April 21st. The Beef Reproduction Task Force is going to be focused on semen handling. I'll be giving that one. So I hope you all come back for that.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. George?
So yeah, the one thing I would add in is we've got really good synchronization protocols. If you buy semen from your reputable places, we have really good semen. To me, a lot of times when I get questioned about things, it comes down to the details. And so everybody has brought up the little details. Joe, semen handling, Lee brought up vaccination, nutrition, it's the little things from year to year that cause the biggest variations. And so I can't stress enough, record keeping and paying attention to all those little details is what allows you to be successful year after year. And so following the protocols, following things correctly, it's the little stuff that comes back to bite you. So.
Yeah, and I'll just summarize here as we end tonight. And everyone made great points, and I often think about the quote in regards to reproductive management. Sort of the bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low cost, and it goes into what everyone of the panelists said. We're making investments in our cow herds and pre-planning and thinking about what we're going to do as sort of a holistic point of view of management, and having realistic expectations and goals. I think is really what we're after as a committee and as a task force to help folks do that. We had a planned hour tonight. It flew by. I will tell you, we didn't answer one question from any of the previous webinars. People might have typed in the same question, but these were all new questions that came in the Q&A tonight. So we really appreciate that. These webinars will continue to happen. Joe made a plug for his already. I already forgot the date for it. Joe, can you unmute yourself and give us that date and time one more?
Yes, it is Wednesday, April 21st. And I think I have it at 5 o'clock Mountain Time. But I will defer to Vitor, because Vitor is the Zoom master. If Vitor's still out there.
Vitor is taking care of his new baby. So we'll
I would say check the website, but I know the date is correct. It's April 21st, Wednesday. We're going to talk about all things semen handling.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate everyone joining tonight. I appreciate the panelists for all being on here. We wish everyone the best of luck as you move into your spring breeding season. We're here on Ask the Expert at beefrepro.org to answer any of your questions and address anything. A lot of good information on that website. As you can see, these are all the different locations to find us here on the screen. And with that, we will see you at the next webinar with Dr. Joe Dalton. So everyone have a great night.